For our first speaker, I'd like to invite up to the podium Elizabeth GLAZER from the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. Liz always impresses me as someone who reminds me that not all people who rise up through the levels of government have to have that the same rigid conformist personality. So,
I'm challenging authority right now, Jeff. Well, thanks, Jeff, for organizing this. Are we supposed to speak into the microphone? Okay.
that's good.
So thanks to Jeff and to John Jay for organizing this. Thanks so much to Pinkerton for your support of this effort and so many other things at John Jay. So I think like a lot of how about that? Is that better? You missed the heartfelt thanks. All right. So I think that I am like many people in this room in that I feel that I'm on a team that's catching the same ball that I just threw, or that my team just threw. When I was with the state, close to home was negotiated and passed. And now I've joined city government, where juvenile justice leaders, many of whom are in this room, are working hard to implement the state statute. And having been on both sides, what's been driven home to me is what's involved in shaping reform and what the stakes are. And I'm going to give you the punchline right up front. The stakes are high. It's not just that close to home is important, though it is. It's important because what we do here and how we do it will be the footprint for how we move forward on other issues in juvenile justice. It'll make it easier or harder for us to take those next steps in juvenile justice reform, but also in reform of the adult system, because juvenile justice reforms, I think, as many people in this room have noted, have turned out to be the opening wedge for what happens in the adult system. And second, because the stakes are so high, we can't let the issues that separate us override the broad agreements that unite us. And I've been waiting many years to be able to say this sentence. As Freud said, there is a narcissism of small differences. When people are closely connected, when they meet in the same rooms, at the same universities, at the same convenings, discuss and work on the same issues, perversely we magnify the differences among us and we create separation and distance that may not reflect the reality of how aligned we really are. So I'd like to take a few minutes to underscore both of these points, the importance of the work and the control we must exercise to not magnify small differences. And I want to do it by taking a peek behind the curtain of how close to home came to be and the work it built on. And I don't pretend at all to compete with the truly comprehensive and excellent work that John Jay has done in the report that's being posted online now. It's from my own particular perspective, so give me a break. And I also want to sort of take a quick look ahead as to what the future could hold. So for several years I was in the governor's office and I worked to support those who were leading the state juvenile justice reform efforts. Leaders like Gladys Carrion, who's here today, whose courageous and path-breaking stance broke new ground in New York and set the path that we're currently on truly remaking New York's system, work that reverberated nationally. And the range of that work to bring science to the practice of juvenile justice was important, but a piece included at the state level figuring out how to bring children in the system closer to home and thinking through whether that goal was better affected by using existing state structures or by devolving that to localities, including New York City. And while at the state, I had the privilege also to work with committed public servants like Linda Gibbs and John Feinblatt, Michelle Sviridoff, Ron Richter, Anna Bermudez, and Vinnie Schiraldi, who were thinking hard at the city level about what makes sense for the children who live there. But I have to tell you that sitting in Albany at the beginning of the new governor's term in January of 2011, it was hard to believe that anything could move. Things were pretty bleak. DOJ had just announced the results of its investigation into the state system, finding violations of constitutional proportions relating to excessive force and the denial of mental health care. And the poster child of those abuses, the Tryon facility, had stood empty for almost a year as a symbol of the intractable union rules that required the staffing of a facility that had long since been emptied of kids. But there was a little glimmer of hope. Something big seemed to be afoot. A month before the governor was sworn into office, he toured the empty facility at Tryon with Commissioner Carrion. And the governor's first state address just a few weeks later provided a galvanizing moment to show the kind of political will that could break through the Tryons and the investigations and show the possibility of a better system. So the state of the state had a litany of important issues. The state was facing a historic $10 billion deficit. It felt like we stood on a precipice. And the governor proposed sweeping reforms, 10% cuts in budget, property tax caps, a complete overhaul of Medicaid. But there was only one issue that had the entire hall of 2,000 people leap to their feet, clapping and shouting in support. And that was when the governor vowed to empty facilities and to lead a reform of the juvenile justice system because, as he said, incarceration is not a jobs program. A few weeks before that speech, Mayor Bloomberg had made his own tour upstate, and now a conversation that had been had intently and intensely, to be sure, but largely among mid-level officials at the state and city level, advocates and others, suddenly got elevated into the spotlight. And in the term that followed, the governor closed 16 juvenile facilities, bringing to 23 the number closed since 2000. And reforms by state and city leaders drove a population that had topped 2,300 in 2000, the year 2000, down to under 600 by mid-2012. So in the mix, the idea of not just closing facilities but keeping kids close to home became a real conversation. And a lot of things were driving this. Clearly, there was the shock of the cost to the system, an eye-popping $260,000 a year for each kid in one level of security. And also at the brutality against the kids, a curtain that had been pulled back by the Justice Department report. But critically, ground had been laid by state and city officials, by providers and advocates and others. And we were also being carried along by a wave of work that had been done over the past decade, both nationally and at the state and local level. A $100 million investment by MacArthur and reaped its own reward by making common wisdom the notion that kids are different, that their brains develop in a different way, and that our treatment of them should take into consideration the capacity or lack of their capacity to assess risk and to control their impulses. And Governor Patterson's task force, chaired by John Jay's own Jeremy Travis, dissected the harm visited on children by the punitive approach and its failure in reducing crime. And there was queasiness all around about the kinds of results that these old ways of doing business was churning out. And there was an affirmative enthusiasm for a new way forward. Jeff Butts's positive youth development became the watchword, as did commitment, even if it was uneven in its execution, to evidence-based practices. New York City had made a compelling case for science. It had instituted a risk assessment instrument at detention, and results demonstrated that risk could be controlled, that programming could be matched, producing less incarceration and more public safety. Detention fell almost 30%, recidivism fell by almost 20%, and the initiative became the cornerstone of an overall juvenile justice reform that led to a 69% reduction in the number of youth confined in youth placement facilities. But by the time the notion of close to home got to policymakers at the state, they were intensely interested. They were interested in a more humane and effective system in a system that was demonstrably neither of those. They wanted to see cost savings in a system that was just inexplicably expensive. And they were beginning to believe that there was science around risk and programming that wasn't total hocus pocus. And so there was an openness to determining whether a system that brought kids close to home, recognized everywhere as a better practice, whether that could be done by a locality as well as by the state. And while it took an enormous amount of work, 2 legislative sessions and much more that preceded that, to pass close to home, what was striking was less the points of friction than how much agreement there was. And that agreement extended right down to mid-level budget officials, which I think, as many people in this room know, are often the absolute key in making sure that policies get implemented and effected. But these mid-level budget officials argued that they would take relatively modest, if any, cost savings because they were convinced that they needed to build a rich set of services for kids as well as a robust plan for oversight to ensure that the plan stayed on track. So I don't underestimate the difficulties past and future. How ready was the state, the city, and providers for the shift that was made on the aggressive timetable that was set out? How well did we forecast who the population would be and what their needs were? What do we do about the AWOL numbers? How do we learn from the non-secure experience for limited secure? And I don't underestimate the painstaking daily work that's already occurred and that lies ahead with everybody with a wrench under the sink trying to figure out how to fix this. But I think that the foundations of the work that unite us, that kids are different from adults, that rehabilitation works better than punitive methods, that science is critical in building enduring and effective structures. These are the critical things to keep our eyes on as we move forward in the hard work of implementation. And we need to keep our eyes on them for at least 2 reasons. First, there are more big pieces to move beyond close to home. The Governor's Commission on Youth Justice that will tackle raising the age of criminal responsibility, among other things, is one of them. And we need to keep our eyes on the prize and find a way to a stable and satisfactory solution without being distracted by the comparatively smaller differences that may separate us. And second, juvenile justice has been a pathbreaker for reforms in the adult system. So as juvenile justice goes, so goes the adult justice. We figured out how to identify well what risk is, and that's led to a fairer system that more can be confident in with fewer kids incarcerated. We're figuring out what kind of programming, both inside and outside, works to reduce offending and lead to more productive lives. And we're getting better at matching the right kids to the right programming. And as this is happening, there's no going backwards from science that works. And there's no going forward on our spidey sense alone. And it's no small measure because of these successes that the focus in the adult system is now how to reduce crime, unnecessary incarceration, and promote fairness by figuring out the right program for the right person at the right time. So the stakes are high. And so let's get to the finish line by focusing on what unites us and not be defeated by what divides us. We have a lot of work to do, so let's get going.